fellow readers. Figured I'd give you fair warning and kind of try and give you an idea of what kind of a reader I am by just giving you a hopefully quick survey of uh, what my reading history is, what my current faves are, what that sort of thing. So let me quickly go into this. Start off with childhood. Had a Scottish and English parents, so had Noddy, the Noddy books, not naughty, but Noddy books by Enid Blyton. I had this the Rupert the Bear series, very British to me, with illustrations. It's the kind of a graphic, my kind of comics, I guess, of my early comics, except they were this wasn't word balloons at this point. This was text underneath, so very British. And I had this terrible feeling I read Black Sambo, and ironically, I think it was probably Helen Bannerman was the author of those books, and she was Scottish, and my father's Scottish. I wonder if it's like his old books that got left on the shelves unattended, or just got like, oh, I remember loving those as a kid, so I'll put them there. So it's one of those things that I just sucked up because nobody was, I don't know if anyone was paying attention or if anyone even thought at this point. This was like probably early 70s when I would have been reading that, what it was, how racist and terrible it was. But yeah, that was there. Of course, of course, I was a big Narnia reader. I think those were the first books I remember getting at the library and then buying myself. So C.S. Lewis, and then his buddy J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit. I think at this point, and then as I got into my adolescence, it's yes, reading Lord of the Rings, reading fantasy. There was sort of the Lord of the Rings fantasy, and then there was the pulp fiction of the time, the Robert E. Howard, because I got to get into secondhand bookstores where you get all those cheap paperbacks, and that was like reading reading kind of that kind of sword and sorcery fantasy as well. Very much more pulp, grand adventure sort of stuff. I think I also big into the science fiction, Asimov, Clarke, that, and then Heinlein. Tons and tons of Heinlein. Oh God, I think it's at a certain point in my life, Strange and Strange Land was probably going to be the literature that went for that was going to be for all time. And I walked around with a T-shirt that said Grok on it. I was such a fucking geek, such a darn geek. I'll try not to swear too much on this channel because it's just lazy. But yeah, and the thing is, I think I twigged on as I went along because luckily his earlier books were the cheap ones, so I bought all those and read those first because you got to his later books, and he just gets more and more crazy, more and more baggy, and just no editing and all that stuff. Speaking of confessions, I read a ton of Piers Anthony, which was, I guess it was my escapist junk at the time. Terrible puns, a lot of sex farce for kind of young horny teens. I don't know if you can get away with that now, or there's probably something else because you're not watching kids. They're finding their stuff wherever they can find it. I mean, now there's the internet, so they can find whatever. And I was also reading. I actually, I think before I got into the secondhand bookstores and reading that, I was reading comics, superhero comics, which I got bored with, and also I was looked at it and went, hey, I can buy a little paperback for a couple of bucks, or I can buy a little comic which for a couple of bucks, but the book is gonna give me way more bang for my buck. So that's definitely where I ended up going. But I got I got bored with superhero comics, and unfortunately I think I bailed out of the system just as kind of more different kind of comics were becoming available even to a kid who is growing up in the interior of BC, which is where I was growing up in Kelowna. So yeah. There's all that. There's the comics. There's the science fiction and fantasy, and then I kind of transitioned into literature, or you know, non-genre, whatever the hell you call those books. Which, interestingly enough, I started off with Anais Nin, The Diaries of Anais Nin, and from that into Henry Miller and Lawrence Durrell, and then just sort of just lit in general, and to your bed. There's a little dog down here, a cute little dog. She's just going to stay there and be a good dog. And I'll try and do the tapes from my records from there. So yeah, so then, I get into all the stuff I read in college and university and stuff like that. Angela Carter, The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman is a real definite standout. And Doris Lessing in The Golden Notebook, such a made me feel so wonderfully sad, and I really love that book. That's one of those books I want to go back to and read again, just because I read it as more of a younger adult at that point. Then it's like stuff like Moby Dick, a perfect example of a book that I bounced off the first time, couldn't get through it. The second time I came back to a couple of years later and was like, is this the same book? And it was like, yeah, this is the same book. And I love the whaling parts. I love all the obsession of the whaling industry, because it's a book about obsession, and that's part of it. And yeah, so that was a great book. And it's got all the it's got the Shakespeare and the Bible in it, and it's the whole kitchen sink. It's just an amazing book. Probably my greatest reading achievement is reading Proust. That's what it's my own little mountain that I feel like I've climbed. Whether I've retained any of it up here, I don't know, but I really enjoyed myself in the year or so or more that it took me to read it. It was one of these things. I'd read a section and then I'd read a couple of other books, and then I'd read a section, I'd read a couple of other books, and I just continually go back to it and back to it. And that was an amazing thing for me. That's yeah. And at some point I'm going to reread it, because I know I got teeny little bit of stuff out of it. I'm going to try not to go too long. Current stuff. I don't know, current stuff. Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay was a book I loved. Christopher Isherwood's Diaries, his 1939 to 1960, is a wonderfully immersive book into somebody's head. Another diary book with Anais Nin and Christopher Isherwood. That's interesting. I don't know if I've read too many more. The Assassin's Cloak I've heard mentioned, and actually I think that's maybe where I got to Christopher Isherwood from. Is an amazing book. The Assassin's Cloak. It's a collection of a whole bunch of people's diaries, told in the order of, like, from the start of a year to the end of the year, and then just inserting people's various things. It's a wonderful selection, really wonderfully edited. The Assassin's Cloak, I would totally recommend that book, and maybe I'll put a link into something wherever they put stuff now in the future and all that stuff. Fun stuff. Christopher Moore, A Dirty Job, my first Christopher Moore, which is my favorite Christopher Moore. I find most people seem to find their first Christopher Moore to be their favorite Christopher Moore, and if they bounce off Christopher Moore, then maybe Christopher Moore wasn't meant for them. I hate his vampire books. I feel like they're just his little cash cow, and I hate those books so much. But like to some of his other more recent stuff, Fool and A Serpent of Venice. Though I think he's got matured as a writer, which may have hurt him, because his adolescent silliness early on was a big, I think, part of his appeal. So that's just fun books. So hopefully that gives you a little idea of what kind of reader I am. I didn't really talk about much of the science fiction and fantasy I read now, but I'm sure that'll come later. I'm sort of a mix of, and I can tell when I'm in a mood. It's like I'll just go to something that's a little less undemanding, or I think that's about it. That's about all I'm going to say at the moment, and we'll go from there. Okay, more videos later. Bye for now, BookTube.